The mission was a race against silence. 1,000 members of the greatest generation were falling away each day. The urgency was not theoretical. It was a ticking clock measured in funerals. The author was a veteran grappling with the ghosts of his own wars in the Middle East. He understood the preservation of these testimonies was not merely historical documentation. It was a desperate act of spiritual conservation. He carried his own baggage, including the visceral memory of an Afghan corpse hitting the pavement. He knew the IED tension that coiled in the gut. This baggage granted him an involuntary fluency in the language of trauma. This shared, unspoken vocabulary was the true key that unlocked the stories of men like Joe Drago. The M1 Garand rifle became the project's sacred vessel. It was more than just steel and polished wood. It was the physical connection that spanned 8 decades of conflict. It represented the moment when a young man realized the world had fundamentally changed. This realization happened whether he was landing at Omaha Beach or patrolling the streets of Fallujah. For the men whose names the author sought, the journey from civilian life to combat was swift and brutal. The schoolboys who arrived at Paris Island were quickly stripped of their former identities. They were forged in the crucible of harsh training. The kindness of a welcoming Marine was instantly replaced by the transformative, often terrifying severity of the drill instructor. This process turned Bernie and thousands like him into a different composition of man. They were ready for the unforgiving coral and jungle of the Pacific. But the transformation was not uniform. For many, the war began long before they saw the enemy. Black soldiers, like Robert Andre, were drafted into a military defined by the Jim Crow system. They faced systemic racism that relegated them to second-class status. This happened even as they prepared to fight for democracy. Japanese-American soldiers, like Lawson Sakai, felt the sting of betrayal. They were labeled 4C, enemy alien, by their own country, yet they formed the legendary 442nd Regimental Combat Team. They were determined to prove their loyalty through unparalleled sacrifice. Their early experiences underscored the challenge the author faced. He had to record not just the heroism of combat, but the profound injustice and moral complexity that permeated the conflict. He needed to move beyond the sanitized, commercially palatable narratives of D-Day and grand victories. The core of the mission lay in these overlooked skirmishes and the untold costs in unsung divisions. It was about the men who fought without medals of honor. They simply survived the sheer, overwhelming scale of a war that claimed 80 million lives. The author's initial encounters confirmed the true, raw human cost. He heard the harrowing accounts of the Battle of Okinawa, a battle twice the size of D-Day. Marines were ordered to kill anything that moved there. The stark reality of civilian bodies caught in the crossfire was the daily norm. He learned of the crushing psychological toll, the survivor's guilt, and the nightmares that never truly faded. The signed rifle, resting now in the author's hands, was heavy with the weight of these legacies. It carried the signature of the man who had been buried alive for 3 days in Anzio. It held the name of the Marine who burned 7 pillboxes on Iwo Jima. It bore the mark of the machine gunner who fought through the frozen horror of the Bulge. Each name was a profound trust. It was a piece of fading history, handed over just in time. This cemented the author's resolve. His job was not just to collect names. He had to ensure that the lessons of integrity, duty, and sacrifice, forged in the crucible of the 1940s, would inspire the veterans of today. They were battling against the perception that they, too, were destined to be broken. The collection had begun. The voices, though aged and frail, were finally speaking their truths. The Pacific War reached a terrible crescendo on Saipan. This battle revealed a new level of desperation in the Japanese defense. The island was drenched in blood and littered with debris from the largest Banzai attack of the war. Saipan became a gruesome laboratory. Here the rules of engagement dissolved into hand-to-hand atrocity. For Marines like Bernie, the fighting became horrifyingly personal. It was waged within arm's length. This brutal, close-quarters struggle left foxholes filled with the mingled dead of both sides. This intense, suicidal fervor underscored the immense cost of securing the Marianas. That strategic victory was necessary for the eventual bombing of mainland Japan. Thousands of miles to the west, the war was fought not just against the enemy, but against the environment itself. Stanley, having been mistakenly shipped to the Burma theatre, found himself in a hell of monsoon rain and mud. The jungle became a living swamp. His unit, Merrill's Marauders, was tasked with disrupting Japanese supply lines, but the primary enemy quickly became disease and starvation. The conditions were so brutal that the soldiers were ravaged by dysentery, high fevers, and typhus. Their bodies failed under the unrelenting humidity and logistical neglect. After seizing the Mietkina airfield, the promised resupply of food and medicine never materialized. Instead, they received tools to repair the runway. This betrayal crushed morale. To survive, the men resorted to consuming anything they could find. They ate tree bark, grass, and even cow dung. This was a desperate bid to stave off the maddening hunger that stalked them through the jungle. Stanley's nightmares, born in the squalor of that campaign, would linger for decades. They stood as a testament to the unique misery of fighting a forgotten war in an unforgiving climate. Meanwhile, in Western Europe, the grinding push toward Hitler's heartland required breaking through the formidable concrete shell of the Siegfried Line. This 390-mile defense system was marked by dragon-teeth obstacles and heavily reinforced pillboxes. It demanded not just brute force but ingenuity. Staff Sergeant Ernie Roberts, an army machine gunner, faced a position that was suppressing his company's advance. Its heavy fire was pinning down the infantry. The pillbox openings or embrasures were just large enough for gun barrels. This rendered a direct assault suicidal. Roberts, with the resourcefulness born of desperation, secured a tree branch. He used it to elevate the barrel of his machine gun. This simple, brilliant improvisation allowed him to direct rounds at a downward angle. He spilled fire directly into the enemy pillbox. The resulting carnage silenced 35 enemy soldiers. It forced the Germans to cease fire and close their embrasures. This bought the crucial time his company needed to advance. This singular act of tactical courage forced open a lane in the monolithic German defences. It earned Roberts the Silver Star. It symbolized the necessity of individual brilliance in overcoming the seemingly insurmountable obstacles of the Western Front. As the Allies advanced, the arrival of the 761st Tank Battalion injected a profound tension into the campaign. The Black Panthers were the first colored armored unit to fight in the American Army. They landed on Omaha Beach, a site already steeped in the legacy of sacrifice. For Robert André and his comrades, the weight of expectation was immense. They were not just fighting the Germans, they were fighting a century of prejudice. They carried the hopes and scrutiny of their entire race. General Patton's address to them was not a standard pep talk. It was a demand for perfection. It served as a warning that the eyes of the nation were fixed upon their success or failure. They drove 400 miles across France to catch up with the front lines. The 761st found a stark contrast in reception. The systemic racism of their own military apparatus was temporarily eclipsed. French civilians cheered, crowding around the M4 Sherman tanks. They saw in these black soldiers the first faces of liberation. The 761st was under immense pressure to prove their combat effectiveness. They knew that any mistake would be seized upon by those who wished to maintain segregation. In the crucible of combat, they were determined to show that courage knew no color. The winter of 1944 to 1945 brought the war to its psychological nadir. It was a season of desperation, where the sheer incompetence of command often proved as deadly as enemy fire. In the Ardennes, the German offensive exploited both Allied complacency and the raw inexperience of the newly deployed 106th Infantry Division. When the surprise attack broke through the lines, the division fractured instantly. They were inadequately supplied and overwhelmed by a 20-1 margin. For men like Clarence Cormier, the war was reduced not to a battle, but to a terrifying, chaotic surrender. He watched as thousands of American soldiers, bewildered and cut off, raised their hands. The subsequent two-day march was a descent into dehumanization. Stripped of their gear and given ill-fitting German boots, Clarence and his comrades began a brutal trek without food or water. They huddled together in the freezing air just to maintain a flicker of warmth. The worst indignity arrived with the transport. They were crammed into unsanitary cattle cars. They stood shoulder to shoulder, unable to sit or move. They existed in a suffocating darkness. The only relief was the freezing wind that slipped through the slats. The months of captivity that followed became a death march. It was characterized by the maddening hunger that drove men to chew on tree bark and cow dung. Their bodies shrank under the twin assaults of starvation and exposure. Meanwhile, the fighting that raged across Belgium was intensely localized. It was defined by the unforgiving cold. The extreme temperatures were a weapon unto themselves. They froze the very tools of war. Rodney Perkins, fighting near Moissy, recalled the paralyzing moment when his M1 Garand froze solid. The oil congealed, the mechanism locked, and he was left utterly defenseless against an unseen enemy. His life depended solely on his ability to flee. German infiltration tactics compounded the terror. They used captured American uniforms to sow confusion. They wore white camouflage suits against the knee-deep snow. Every shadow became a potential enemy. When a replacement soldier, mistaking a camouflaged German for a friend, challenged him, the ensuing, brutal killing underscored the constant, nerve-shredding danger. Could you trust the wrong face in that blinding, frozen landscape? This brutality culminated in the Malmedy massacre. It was an atrocity that burned a permanent hole in the memory of those who witnessed it. Steve Domitrovich, an ambulance driver, survived the mass execution of 84 American prisoners only by collapsing immediately and playing dead. As the machine guns ripped through the ranks of the surrendered men, the air filled with the sickening sound of bullets hitting flesh. Steve lay motionless in the mud and blood. The taunts of the SS officers rang in his ears as they moved among the fallen. They were administering final shots to the head. He felt the weight of a German SS trooper's boot land next to his face. The smell of leather and snow was inches from his nose. His entire existence was suspended in the agonizing gamble that his breath would not betray him. This survival, born from a desperate primal act, would become the bedrock of his lifelong instinctual resilience. Thousands of miles south, the war in Italy was a grinding, costly affair. It was often fueled by strategic hubris. General Mark Clark's overriding ambition to seize Rome led directly to the disastrous Rapido River crossing. The 36th Infantry Division was ordered to cross the flooded river. Relentless German shelling had turned it into a mine-riddled swamp. The assault was a massacre. Santo Di Salvo, hospitalized with a wound that saved him from participating, later heard the horrific accounts. Human body parts soared through the air amid the constant shell bursts. The riverbanks were flooded with blood and black mud. Of the 4,000 men who attempted the crossing, only a few hundred made it back. The rest were swallowed by the river, the mines, and the German machine guns. It was a failure of command so profound that the human cost seemed almost unbelievable. It challenged the narrative of American military invincibility. On the Anzio beachhead, infantryman DiCicco endured a different kind of hell. During an intense German air raid, the building he was sheltering in took a direct hit. The explosion buried him under 4 feet of rubble. He was pinned in the darkness alongside his dying comrade, James Craig. For 3 agonizing days, Carl lay trapped. He was unable to breathe deeply or to see. He was surrounded by the crushing weight of concrete and the silence of the dead. In that subterranean tomb, facing certain death, he made a desperate promise to God. If he survived, he vowed he would mark the date every year in solemn remembrance. Karl's resilience was later tested again during the advance toward the Gothic line. His platoon was pinned down by a murderous volume of fire emanating from a fortified German pillbox. After Staff Sergeant Davis was killed while attempting to negotiate a surrender, the platoon was paralyzed. Karl recognized that their survival demanded a single decisive act. He was armed with a Browning automatic rifle and an M1 Garand fitted with a rifle grenade. He began a low crawl. He moved beneath the barbed wire. The ground was spitting dirt around him from the machine gun fire. He continued until he outflanked the position. He fired a rifle grenade which detonated near the pillbox, momentarily stunning the occupants. Then, pouring a relentless stream of automatic rifle fire into the embrasure, he forced the German gunners to close their opening. This action bought his pinned-down comrades the seconds they needed to advance. It led directly to the surrender of the remaining Germans. It was a moment of individual courage that broke the enemy's stranglehold and saved his platoon from annihilation. These moments of desperate survival, strategic disaster, and singular heroism defined the relentless, brutal nature of the war's darkest winter. The final months of the war were a relentless, desperate grind. They demanded acts of courage that bordered on the suicidal. On the black volcanic sands of Iwo Jima, The landscape was a shattered ruin of ash and concrete. The cost of victory was immediately visible. Dead Marines were stacked like cords of wood. The immense casualties necessitated the deployment of every available man. This included reserve demolitionists like Corporal Herschel Woody Williams. He faced a network of reinforced concrete pillboxes. These fortifications were impervious to bazookas and immune to airstrikes. Woody knew the mission was a death sentence. His extraordinary 4-hour struggle against these fanatically defended Japanese strongpoints was a defining moment of individual heroism. He ran repeatedly back to the lines to fetch demolition charges and fresh flamethrowers. He advanced alone under a terrific hail of enemy small arms fire. He became a one-man inferno. He inserted the nozzle of his weapon directly into the apertures and air vents of the bunkers. Though he survived to receive the Medal of Honor, Woody always maintained that the medal belonged to his 2 riflemen. They were Corporal Warren Bornholtz and Private First Class Charles Fisher. They had died covering his advance. The honor was not a celebration of survival. It was a lifelong solemn burden to carry the memory of the unacknowledged sacrifices that had defined his darkest day. In the Pacific, every acre of ground was paid for in blood. The campaign for Okinawa, the largest naval invasion of the war, devolved into protracted close-quarters combat for strategic high points. Sugarloaf Hill was one such hellish objective. It changed hands 11 times in a single week. This was the environment that crushed men like Joe Drago. The fighting was so intense that the Marines' position was constantly contested, even after heavy losses. Corporal James L. Day, fighting forward of the front lines on the hill, found his squad reduced to a handful of men. When a fanatical ground attack of 40 Japanese soldiers slammed into their position, Day yielded no ground. He remained at the forefront, hurling hand grenades and directing fire. He shouted encouragement until his voice was raw. On 3 separate occasions, Japanese soldiers closed to within a few feet of his foxhole. This forced him into brutal personal combat. He refused to abandon the seriously wounded. He braved intense fire to escort 4 injured Marines, one at a time, back to safety. His relentless defense left more than 70 enemy dead around his position. It preserved the lives of his fellow Marines.